All right, I want to talk about this. We've been talking about this in the office for a couple of days, and it has actually gotten more attention in the right-wing media than it has anywhere else. And it's Tucker Carlson, exactly. But oddly enough, Tucker is, and we've got probably too much of this video. He did a 15-minute monologue on Fox News at 8 p.m. Does he do this show?
I thought he was, wait, yeah, he's 8, yep.
And it is a critique of the market. And so it's sort of fascinating because I'm not sure that it's important at all, but it also could be.
I think the fact that the guy is able to articulate these arguments and then latch them on to like white nationalism is actually pretty important.
Yeah, there's some scary precedent for that, incidentally, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. But let's. This is the first clip. What he starts talking about Mitt Romney's critique op-ed the other day in the Washington Post, I think it was, of Donald Trump, where Mitt Romney takes, I think it was about 500 words, to say that Donald Trump is super rude, but I'm going to vote for everything that comes down the pike that is even remotely close to what he wants.
Exactly.
And Tucker takes issue not with his critique of Trump as being rude, essentially, but takes issue with what is basically the Republican agenda. Play this first.
Corporate tax cuts are also popular in Washington, and Romney is strongly on board with those too. His piece throws a rare compliment to Trump for cutting the corporate rate a year ago. That's not surprising. Romney spent the bulk of his business career at a firm called Bain Capital. Bain Capital all but invented what is now a familiar business strategy: take over an existing company for a short period of time, cut costs by firing employees, run up the debt, extract the wealth, and move on, sometimes leaving retirees without their earned pensions. Romney became fantastically rich doing this. Meanwhile, a remarkable number of the companies are now bankrupt or extinct. This is the private equity model. A ruling class sees nothing wrong with it. It's how they run the country. Mitt Romney refers to unwavering support for a finance-based economy and an internationalist foreign policy as the mainstream Republican view, and he's right about that. For generations, Republicans have considered it their duty to make the world safe for banking, while simultaneously prosecuting ever more foreign wars. Modern Democrats generally support those goals enthusiastically. There are signs, however, that most people do not support this agenda, and not just here in America. In countries around the world, France, Brazil, Sweden, the Philippines, Germany, many others, voters suddenly are backing candidates and ideas that would have been unimaginable just a decade ago. These are not isolated events. What you're watching is entire populations revolting against leaders who refuse to improve their lives. Something like this has been happening in our country for the past 3 years. Donald Trump rode a surge of popular discontent all the way to the White House. Does he understand the political revolution that he harnessed? Can he reverse the economic and cultural trends that are destroying America? Those are open questions. But they're less relevant than we think. At some point, Donald Trump will be gone. The rest of us will be gone too. The country will remain. What kind of country will it be then? How do we want our grandchildren to live? Those are the only questions that matter. The answer to them used to be obvious. The overriding goal for America is more prosperity, meaning cheaper consumer goods. But is that still true? Does anyone still believe that cheaper iPhones or more Amazon deliveries of plastic garbage from China are going to make us happy? They haven't so far. A lot of Americans are drowning in stuff, and yet drug addiction and suicide are depopulating large parts of the country. Anyone who thinks the health of a nation can be summed up in GDP is an idiot. The goal for America is both simpler and more elusive than mere prosperity. It's happiness. There are a lot of ingredients in being happy: dignity, purpose, self-control, independence, above all, deep relationships with other people. Those are the things that you want for your children. They're what our leaders should want for us and would want if they cared, but our leaders don't care.
Sort of fucks with your head a little bit, doesn't it? right? Because the kids are vacillating back and forth between this whiny, entitled guy and then saying stuff like, oh shit, yeah, no, he's right.
Shouldn't we prioritize friendship?
That was quite the pivot when he went to fascists in Brazil.
Yeah, that really was the giveaway.
Well-
Brazil was the tell.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of these things that he drops in at certain moments, right? Where it's sort of, he's going down a path and then he sort of and that's what's interesting about all of this on some level. At the end of the day, and we're going to play a couple more of these clips, at the end, there's a rich history of this. Sometimes it gets pretty ugly. But then he goes on to say that our leaders don't care. It's just a weird, at the end, I mean, if you follow this, he is trying to establish, I guess you could call it the patriarchy, or sort of the primary building block for authoritarianism on some level. So it's all about these leaders who have betrayed us in some fashion, right? You can hear some distant echoes of this stuff. Here is, he goes on to say that, that Democrats / libertarians, apparently most of the libertarians are in the Democratic Party in
Totally.
Tucker's.
Classical liberals.
There's a lot of classical liberals.
Interesting ideas.
And social conservatives have had sort of two critiques that have come from a different place but ended up in the same area, which is that economics and culture are separate. Here, play number 2.
Yet the pathologies of modern rural America are familiar to anyone who visited downtown Baltimore in the 1980s. Stunning out-of-wedlock birth rates, high male unemployment, a terrifying drug epidemic. Two different worlds, similar outcomes. How did this happen? Well, you'd think our ruling class would be deeply interested in knowing the answer, but mostly they're not. They don't have to be interested. It's easier to import foreign labor to take the place of native-born Americans who are slipping behind.
Nice.
But Republicans now represent rural voters. They ought to be interested. And here's a big part of the answer. Male wages declined. Manufacturing, a male-dominated industry, all but disappeared over the course of a generation. All that remained in many places were the schools and the hospitals, and both of them are traditional employers of women. In many areas, women suddenly made more than men. Now, before you applaud that as a victory for feminism, consider some of the effects. Study after study has shown that when men make less than women, women generally don't want to marry them. Now, maybe they should want to marry them, but they don't. Over big populations, this causes a drop in marriage, a spike in out-of-wedlock births, and all the familiar disasters that inevitably follow. More drug and alcohol abuse, higher incarceration rates, fewer families formed in the next generation. This is not speculation. It's not propaganda from the evangelicals. It's social science. We know it's true. Rich people know it best of all. That's why they get married before they have kids.
So give everybody
that model
healthcare,
works.
asshole.
But increasingly, marriage is a luxury only the affluent in America can afford. And yet, and here's the bewildering and infuriating part, those very same affluent married people, the ones who make virtually all the decisions in our society, are doing pretty much nothing to help the people below them get and stay married.
What have you done, Sam? This whole thing is a sham.
It's a sham. You know.
When are you going to find Matt and Michael some wives, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh.
So, there's a lot to unpack here. Part of it is that a problem doesn't get real until it starts affecting white people, according to Tucker. That's one of the problems. And his whole marriage calculation seems a little bit muddled. It is, having kids is expensive. There's some things that we could do in terms of, broadly speaking, some government programs, but we're going to wait until we get to the end where he announces, like, apparently there's no way to help those people.
Right. There isn't like a whole obvious set of policies that would take the problem off of the table immediately.
There's no examples in the world.
Wealth.
It's completely,
Right.
We have no idea how to get there.
We have no clue.
Well, this is what's so creepy about Tucker Carlson, because there's always a grain of truth in what he's saying, but then his prescription to solve the problems is like way the wrong way.
Now,
But even there, you know what that actually reminds me of? You remember Waiting for Superman?
yes.
Right? So that's like peak Obama neoliberal school propaganda. And the major thing in that movie, they say, is it's like, it's not that Scarsdale had expensive, great public schools because they're all loaded. And the South Bronx had schools that were in tougher shape because of class and race and redistribution. It was that Scarsdale has amazing neighborhoods because the schools were awesome. And it just happened, like he's reverse engineering the after effect of a social problem to be the cause. And they did that in the Obama era.
In
And
terms
that
of
was
education.
with schools. Everybody accepted that kind of delusional second order thinking.
Now, here is, this clip is a little bit less relevant, but it's a lot more fun in this monologue. And it's also sort of like what I think is going to keep, it's hard to know what Tucker's up to when you hear this clip. This is clip number 3 of this, yes.
Speak out against the ugliest parts of our financial system. Not all commerce is good. Why is it defensible to loan people money they can't possibly repay, or charge them interest that impoverishes them? Payday loan outlets in poor neighborhoods collect 400% annual interest. Are we okay with that? We should not be. Libertarians tell us that's how markets work, consenting adults making voluntary decisions about how to live their lives. Okay, but it's also disgusting.
All right, pause it.
If you care about...
Yeah, he's totally nailing it.
Well, I mean,
He's totally nailing this part.
now, his 4-part series on the way that Mick Mulvaney was pulling apart the Consumer Financial
go.
Protection Bureau was devastating. Unfortunately, they never aired. You got to be a deep, deep Tucker member to get access to that material. They have a special Patreon where they lock that up. And, there was a lot of inroads made, both statutorily in terms of regulation about that. I don't remember him complaining about it, but it's nice to know that he's there now that there's no way any of that is going to be held to account, at least under this administration. But watch where he goes here. This is an interesting turn.
Okay, but it's also disgusting. If you care about America, you ought to oppose the exploitation of Americans, whether it's happening in the inner city or on Wall Street.
What happens in India?
And by the way, if you really loved your fellow Americans, as our leaders should, it would break your heart to see them high all the time, which they are. A huge number of our kids, especially our boys, are smoking weed constantly. You may not realize that because new technology has made it all but odorless, but it's everywhere. And that's not an
Pause
accident.
it. No, wait a second. We got to go back a little bit. So we have a massive opioid epidemic in this country. That is a function of a pharmaceutical company and the entire supply chain delivery mechanism that was corrupt to the core, illicit, and just beyond reprehensible. They should all be literally charged with manslaughter, if not maybe second-degree murder.
Or like summarily.
But somehow it's the odorless pot that really gets you.
But can I just say, though, following Tucker, I look out on all of you and feeling the love we have for you, I'm incredibly sad at this really high audience.
All right, just go back just a little bit because
Matt Leck is smoking weed right now.
Matt Leck makes me depressed every hour.
It's invisible.
Especially our boys are smoking weed constantly. You may not realize that because new technology has made it all but odorless, but it's everywhere. And that's not an accident. Once our leaders understood they could get rich from marijuana became ubiquitous. In many places, tax-hungry politicians have legalized or decriminalized it. Former Speaker of the House John Boehner now lobbies for the marijuana industry. His fellow Republicans seem fine with that. Oh, but it's better for you than alcohol, they tell us. Maybe. Who
He
cares?
could tell you that.
Pause it, yeah, exactly.
John Boehner could definitely vouch.
yeah. That's why when you see Boehner now, he's not weeping anymore. He's high.
Yeah,
That's right.
he evened his emotional state out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Alcohol,
I-
they tell us. Maybe. Who cares? Talk about missing the point. Try having dinner with a 19-year-old who's been smoking weed. The life is gone. Passive, flat, trapped in their own heads. Do you want that for your kids?
Try doing a show every day with a 50-year-old who just smoked weed, trapped in his own
How
head.
many times is Tucker having dinner with a high 19-year-old guy?
Inquiring minds want to know.
We don't know what he does in his free time.
Well, I mean, he could have it's conceivable he has a 19-year-old kid. I bet you he does. But, like, just deal with it at home, dude.
This segment is dedicated to you tonight, son.
Right.
You know me, Dad.
When I'm done talking about the fucking gypsies, it's about you.
Do you people have any idea what it's like how kids fight over a beanbag chair? That's what my past 2 days have been about.
Who won?
They eat all your snacks.
They both have won. I'm out of the house.
Right.
Just so I don't have to hear them yell about the beanbag chair. All right, continue.
Cares. Talk about missing the point. Try having dinner with a 19-year-old who's been smoking weed. The life is gone. Passive, flat, trapped in their own heads. Do you want that for your kids? Of course not. Then why are our leaders pushing it on us? You know the reason. Because they don't care about us. When you care about people, you do your best to.
Okay, that's
That
what
was a little almost like white Malcolm X-y. It was so weird. He was like,
Hey, when you're pacified.
Right. It is
Bizarre.
That was a bizarre turn. Everybody's getting high and they're flaccid at
he's
dinner.
got to look for the non sequitur.
He's a real good pivoter.
Yeah.
All right, and then he finishes,
Revolt, which is why I want to talk about weed.
and he finishes with a direct attack on the market. I mean,
I'm back on board.
Yeah, let's watch it. Let's keep.
Nothing divides us like the perception that some people are getting special treatment. In our country, some people definitely are getting special treatment. Republicans should oppose that with everything they have. So the question is, what kind of country
Now
do you
pause it for
wanna
1
live
second,
in?
because I should say that just before this, he said that elites. He started to, he does everything very quickly, and so it's vague enough that it can mean a couple of different things to different people. But at one point, right before that, he says, elites are just letting people into colleges based upon what they look like, and blah blah blah. And wait, what? Are elites just letting people into colleges based on what they look like? And he sort of he pivots here to talking about this notion of special treatment. And a big part of the problem with special treatment is the complete lack of accountability for his folks. I mean, the people he used to work with at Fox, for one, the President of the United States. I mean, there's a lot of different, special treatment comes in a lot of different forms. When he says special treatment, we may hear that one, but I think his audience hears another one. But continue.
The question is, what kind of country do you want to live in? Well, a fair country, a decent country, a cohesive country, a country whose leaders don't accelerate the forces of change purely for their own profit and amusement, a country you might recognize when you're old, a country that listens to young people who don't live in Brooklyn,
Not so subtle.
Right.
a country where you can make a solid living outside of the big cities, a country where Lewiston, Maine seems almost as important as the west side of Los Angeles, a country where environmentalism
Pause it.
means
No,
getting
I should remind you that exactly. This whole formulation of normal people.
I went to college in Lewiston, Maine, and it's very lacking in normal people. I mean, I love the place.
Not to
I
mention,
should also like to remind Tucker that per capita, Lewiston, Maine gets a lot more representation in the Senate, let's say, than folks living in California.
I was going to say, no one in a city has ever struggled to make a living, Tucker.
That doesn't happen.
Exactly.
All right, but you go back, because I just get fascinated by this use of normal people. Like, I've used that as a joke to say, like, we need a normal president, not a black guy and a woman, but a normal president, right? And this guy's using it, and I'm not sure exactly what he means. Well, I do know what he means.
Yeah, right. I think he's
do.
using it in a really similar way.
country where you can make a solid living outside of the big cities, a country where Lewiston, Maine seems almost as important as the west side of Los Angeles, a country where environmentalism means getting outside and picking up the trash, a clean, orderly, stable country that respects itself. And above all, a country where normal people with an average education who grew up no place special can get married and have happy kids and repeat unto the generations. A country that actually cares about families, the building block of everything. What will it take to get a country like that? Leaders who want it. For now, those leaders will have to be Republicans.
Socialism.
There's no option at this point. But first, Republican leaders will have to acknowledge that market capitalism is not a religion. Market capitalism is a tool, like a staple gun or a toaster. You'd have to be a fool to worship it. Our system was created by human beings for the benefit of human beings. We do not exist to serve markets, just the opposite. Any economic system that weakens and destroys families is not worth having. A system like that is the enemy of a healthy society. Internalizing all this will not be easy for Republican leaders. They'll have to unlearn decades of bumper sticker talking points and corporate propaganda. They'll likely lose donors in the process. They'll be criticized. Libertarians are certain to call any deviation from market fundamentalism a form of socialism. That's a lie. Socialism is a disaster. It does not work. In fact, it's what we should be working desperately to avoid. But socialism is exactly what we're going to get, and very soon, unless a group of responsible people in our political system
From your mouth to
reforms
God's
the
ears,
American
Tucker.
economy in a way that protects normal people. If you want to put America first, you've got to put its families first.
I love the juxtaposition, like,
Socialism, disaster. Fascism, really good.
Right.
Fascism works really well.
There's not many places for him to go after this, is there?
do you remember when,
It's national socialism, right? It's not real socialism. It's like, social democracy plus white supremacy equals what he wants.
It's just about the families.
yeah, do you remember when it came out that Jeff Sessions did have a problem with the Klan? Do you guys remember why he had a problem
Yes.
with the Klan? Because they smoke weed?
Too much weed.
That monologue was like a high Klan session. Like, we're not in touch with each other enough, man. Markets to serve us.
It's weird because he is identifying real problems, and some of these are real problems with liberalism and with things that Democrats and Republicans have done. Like, we have these stingy little means-tested programs. Like, I recently talked to someone who's an expert on the welfare rights movement of the 60s and 70s. Government workers would come to women's houses, mostly single black moms, and if they found a man's slippers, they would kick them off of welfare. But the answer to that is universal programs and more benefits. It's not to take them away.
Or we could do a Facebook opt-in. And if you're single, there could be a sliding scale for daycare, as well as an Uber voucher, which you'll reimburse 50% at the end of the month for a rebate at the end of the year, which will be given in the form of another voucher. And that's fresh thinking. You guys ready?
Yeah, well,
I went that, it was like okay for a couple of minutes.
yeah. I just, I wanted to play that Tucker Carlson thing. It's going to be interesting to see where he goes from here. I mean, at first I was a little bit worried about it, but I just think that this is maybe just more of a career thing for him. It's hard for me to see a movement that gets built around the criticism of market capitalism, but Republican daddies are our only hope.
Well, his problem is he doesn't have. Steve Bannon always keeps his pretend like, I wanted rich people to have more taxes. And that's like his fake, see, I'm the real deal. And Tucker has none of those. He should have at least one or two fake policies that coincide with that argument.
Well, maybe that's
Or
coming
Shark
next.
Test.
That could be coming.
It's coming next.
But it's
yeah,
going to
it
be
is
like,
exactly what
Jeff
Jack said.
Bezos should be quartered.
Exactly.
that's for Trump. And we could build a coalition
tough,
around
yeah.
that.
I do worry that Republicans will adopt more of this rhetoric, even if they're not actually creating any kind of policies that help the working class.
I think that's true. I think it's going to be just mostly rhetorical.
Well, Trump already did that. He
Right.
did the blueprint.
I don't know if that necessarily is a problem for the left or a problem for the right. I mean, this is, in my mind, a totally defensive move. I mean, there was a time where there was no relationship between social conservatives and the sort of market fundamentalist Republicans. I mean, for a long time, right? I mean, prior really until the 60s, the late 60s into the 70s, the evangelicals were not terribly associated with the Republican Party. These were not the same programs, right? I mean, I think Eric Levitz wrote, had a graph in his response to this where, you know, being against abortion does not necessarily mean that you want tax breaks for oil refineries. You know, these things don't necessarily coincide, but they've been able to cobble together this coalition. And if anything, this breaks it apart, and that's going to further hurt the right. It will infringe perhaps a little bit on the left, but because there are people who.
But that being said, because they won't follow through, right? Like if they got into power and they exploited people's xenophobia and they actually pushed for, say, like a public option on health, like just stipulate that Trump wasn't complete scam artist and bullshit. And what if in the first couple of weeks you had a Muslim ban, you had all of these things that pay to people's fear and bigotry, and you had a stimulus plan, and you had a public option, and you had tax increases for the rich? That would be a pretty terrifying thing to respond to.
The real question is.
And that is happening in some European countries.
Happening in Europe.
Yeah.
Yes. I don't know, and I think when Trump got elected, that was a big question.
We were concerned about that.
That was a big question. You know, what if he comes in with like an actual infrastructure program where we're gonna put billions into train.
Jamie's right, because then like Schumer would be like, you should be a little bit more polite to Muslims, but this infrastructure bill is way too hard on the Wall Street banks.
Well, yeah,
We would be fucked.
it would have been interesting to see what happened, but Donald Trump, of course, turns out not to be that fantasy Donald Trump that I don't know who thought, but, well, I do. I have ideas of who thought that, but we're not going to say their names.